Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 6 of Book 3 of the Paddington series. This chapter is called Trouble at the Launderette, which I think is the British word for laundromat. The green front door of number 32 Windsor Gardens slowly opened and some whiskers and two black ears poked out through the gap. They turned first to the right and then to the left and then suddenly disappeared from view again. A few seconds later, the quiet of the morning was broken by a strange trundling noise, followed by a series of loud bumps as Paddington lowered Mr. Brown's wheelbarrow down the steps and onto the pavement. He peered up and down the street once more and then hurried back indoors. Paddington made a number of journeys back and forth between the house and the wheelbarrow, and each time he came through the front door he was carrying a large pile of things in his paws. There were clothes, sheets, pillowcases, towels, several tablecloths, not to mention a number of old jerseys belonging to Mr. Curry, all of which he carefully placed in the barrow. Paddington was pleased there was no one about. He felt sure that neither the Browns nor Mr. Curry would approve if they knew he was taking their washing to the laundrette in a wheelbarrow. But an emergency had arisen, and Paddington wasn't the sort of bear who allowed himself to be beaten by trifles. Paddington had had a busy time, what with one thing and another. Mrs. Bird was due back shortly before lunch, and there had been a lot of clearing up to do. He had spent most of the early part of the morning going round the house with what was left of a feather duster, getting rid of flour stains from the previous day's cooking, and generally making everything neat and tidy. It was while he had been dusting the mantelpiece in the dining room that he had suddenly come across a small pile of money and one of Mrs. Bird's notes. Mrs. Bird often left notes about the house, reminding people to do certain things. This was one headed laundry, and it was heavily underlined. Not only did it say that the Browns' laundry was due to be collected that very day, but it also had a postscript on the end saying that Mr. Curry had arranged to send some things as well and would they please be collected. Paddington hurried around as fast as he could, but he still took some time to gather all the Browns' washing, and having to fetch Mr. Curry's had delayed things even more. He'd been so busy making out a list of all the things that he'd quite failed to hear the knock at the front door, and had arrived there just in time to see the laundry van disappearing down the road. Paddington had run after it, shouting and waving his paws, but either the driver hadn't seen him or he hadn't wanted to, for the van had turned a corner before he was even halfway down Windsor Gardens. It was while he was sitting on the pile of washing in the hall, trying to decide what to do next and how to explain it all to Mrs. Bird, that the idea of the laundrette had entered Paddington's mind. In the past, Mr. Gruber had often spoken to him on the subject of laundrettes. Mr. Gruber took his own washing along to one every Wednesday evening when they stayed open late. "And very good it is too, Mr. Brown," he was fond of saying. "You simply put the clothes into a big machine and then sit back while it does all the work for you. You meet some interesting people as well. I've had many a nice chat. And if you don't want to chat, you can always watch the washing going round and round inside the machine." Mr. Gruber always made it sound most interesting, and Paddington had often wanted to investigate the matter. The only difficulty, as far as he could see, was getting all the laundry there in the first place. The Browns always had a lot of washing, far too much to go into his shopping basket on wheels, and the laundrette was some way away at the top of a hill. In the end, Mr. Brown's wheelbarrow had seemed the only answer to the problem. But now that he had finished loading it and was about to set off, Paddington looked at it rather doubtfully. He could only just reach the handles with his paws, and when he tried to lift the barrow, it was much heavier than he had expected. Added to that, there was such a pile of washing on board, he couldn't see round the sides, let alone over the top, which made pushing most difficult. To be on the safe side, he tied a handkerchief to the end of an old broomstick, which he stuck in the front of the barrow to let people know he was coming. Paddington had often seen the same thing done on lorries when they had a heavy load, and he didn't believe in taking any chances. Quite a number of people turned to watch Paddington's progress as he made his way slowly up the long hill. Several times he got the wheel caught in a drain and had to be helped out by a kindly passer-by, and at one point, when he had to cross a busy street, a policeman held up all the traffic for him. Paddington thanked him very much and raised his hat to all the waiting cars and buses, which tooted their horns in reply. It was a hot day, and more than once he had to stop and mop his brow with a pillowcase, so that he wasn't at all sorry when he rounded a corner and found himself outside the laundrette. He sat down on the edge of the pavement for a few minutes in order to get his breath back, and when he got up again, he was surprised to find a rusty old bicycle wheel lying on top of the washing. "I expect someone thought you were a rag-and-bone bear," said the stout, motherly lady in charge of the laundrette, who came outside to see what was going on. "A rag-and-bone bear!" exclaimed Miss Paddington hotly. He looked most offended. "I'm not a rag-and-bone bear, I'm a laundry bear." The lady listened while Paddington explained what he had come for and at once called out for one of the other assistants to give him a hand up the steps with his barrow. "I suppose you're doing it for the whole street?" she asked, as she viewed the mountain of washing. "Oh, no," said Paddington, waving his paw vaguely in the direction of Windsor Gardens. "It's for Mrs. Bird." "Mrs. Bird?" repeated the stout lady, looking at Mr. Curry's jerseys and some old gardening socks of Mr. Brown's, which were lying on top of the pile. She opened her mouth as if she was about to say something, but closed it again hurriedly when she saw Paddington staring at her. "I'm afraid you'll need 4 machines for all this lot," she said briskly as she went behind the counter. "It's a good job it's not one of our busy mornings. I'll put you in the ones at the end, 11, 12, 13, and 14. Then you'll be out of the way." She looked at Paddington. "You do know how to work them?" "I think so," said Paddington, trying hard to remember all that Mr. Gruber had told him. "Well, if you get into any trouble, the instructions are on the wall." The lady handed Paddington 8 little plastic tubs full of powder. "Here's the soap powder," she continued. "That's 2 tubs for each machine. You tip 1 tubful in a hole in the top each time a red light comes on. That'll be £4, please." Paddington counted out Mrs. Bird's money and, after thanking the lady, began trundling his barrow along to the other end of the room. As he steered his barrow in and out of people's feet, he looked around the laundrette with interest. It was exactly as Mr. Gruber had described it to him. The washing machines, all white and gleaming, were in a line round the walls, and in the middle of the room were 2 long rows of chairs. The machines had glass portholes in their doors, and Paddington peered through several of them as he went past and watched the washing going round and round in a flurry of soapy water. By the time he reached the end of the room, he felt quite excited, and he was looking forward to having a go with the Browns' washing. Having climbed up on one of the chairs and examined the instructions on the wall, Paddington tipped his laundry out onto the floor and began sorting it into 4 piles, putting all Mr. Curry's jerseys into one machine, all the Browns' washing into the other 3. But although he had read the instructions most carefully, Paddington soon began to wish Mr. Gruber was there to advise him. First of all, there was a matter of a knob on the front of each machine. It was marked hot wash and warm wash, and Paddington wasn't at all sure about it. But being a bear who believed in getting his money's worth, he decided to turn them all to hot. And then there was the question of the soap. Having 4 machines to look after made things very difficult, especially as he had to climb up on a chair each time in order to put it in. No sooner had a red light gone out on one machine than another lit up, and Paddington spent the first 10 minutes rushing between the 4 machines, pouring soap through the holes in the top as fast as he could. There was a nasty moment when he accidentally poured some soap into number 10 by mistake, and all the water bubbled over the side. But the lady whose machine it was very nice about it and explained that she'd already put 2 lots in. Paddington was glad when at long last all the red lights went out and he was able to sit back on one of the seats and rest his paws. He sat there for some time, watching the washing being gently tossed round and round. But it was such a nice soothing motion, and he felt so tired after his labours that in no time at all he dropped off to sleep. Suddenly he was brought back to life by the sound of a commotion and by someone poking him. It was the stout lady in charge, and she was staring at one of Paddington's machines. "What have you got in number 14? she demanded. "Number 14? Paddington thought for a moment and then consulted his laundry list. "I think I put some jerseys in there." The stout lady raised her hands in horror. "Oh, Elsie," she cried, calling to one of her assistants, "there's a young bear put his jerseys in number 14 by mistake." "What?" cried Paddington. "I didn't put them in by mistake. I did it on purpose. Besides," he added, looking most worried at the expression on the lady's face, "they're not my jerseys, they're Mr. Curry's." "Well, whoever they belong to," said the lady as she hurriedly switched off the machine, "I hope he's long and thin." "Oh dear," said Paddington, getting more and more worried. "I'm afraid Mr. Curry's rather short." "That's a pity," said the lady sympathetically, "because he's got some long, thin jerseys now. You had the machine switched to hot wash, and you should never do that with woolens. There's a special notice about that." Paddington gazed in horror as the lady withdrew a dripping mass of wool from the machine and placed it in his barrow. "Mr. Curry's jerseys," he said bitterly to the world in general as he sat back in his chair. Paddington had been a bit worried about Mr. Curry's jerseys right from the start. After the episode of the kitchen table, he hadn't been very keen on meeting Mr. Curry, and he had to lie in wait until the coast was clear before slipping into his kitchen. He'd found the jerseys in a pile by the sink, but there had been nothing to say whether they were meant to be washed or not. Paddington had a nasty feeling in the back of his mind that the answer was not, and now he was sure of it. Paddington often found that shocks came in twos, and as he sat back in his chair, he received his second shock for the morning. His eyes nearly popped out of his head as one of the other machines containing the Browns' washing began making a very strange whirring noise. The whirring was followed by several loud clicks, and Paddington stared at the machine in amazement as the washing inside began to spin round faster and faster until it suddenly disappeared, leaving a gaping hole in the middle. He jumped up and peered through the porthole at the empty space where, only a few moments before, his washing had been. Then he hurriedly began to undo the knob on the side of the machine. It was all very strange, and it definitely needed investigating. Paddington wasn't quite sure what happened next, but as he opened the door, a stream of hot, soapy water shot out, nearly knocking his hat off, and as he fell over backwards on the floor, most of Mrs. Bird's washing seemed to land on top of his head. Paddington lay on his back in a pool of water and listened to the shrieks and cries going on all around him. Then he closed his eyes, put his paws in his ears, and waited for the worst to happen. "I think they've been having trouble at the laundrette," said Mrs. Bird. "When I came past in the bus just now, there was quite a crowd outside and water running out of the door, not to mention bubbles everywhere." "The laundrette," said Mrs. Brown, looking rather worried. "That's right," said Mrs. Bird. "Mr. Curry's had a burglary. Someone broke into his kitchen in broad daylight and took some of Jersey's he'd been putting out for mending." Mrs. Bird had just arrived back from her holiday, and she was exchanging all the news with Mrs. Brown. "If I'd known what was going on," she continued, "I wouldn't have had a minute's peace. Jonathan and Judy away with you, and Mr. Brown ill in bed." She raised her hands in horror at the thought of it all. "We've been doing very well," said Mr. Brown as he sat up in bed. "Paddington's been looking after us." Said Mrs. Bird. "That's as may be." Mrs. Bird had made her way upstairs, and she had also found the remains of her feather duster hidden in the hall stand. "Have you seen Paddington anywhere?" asked Mrs. Brown. "He went out just now, but said he wouldn't be very long." "No," said Mrs. Bird, "and that's another thing. There are wheelbarrow trails right through the house, all the way up from the shed, through the kitchen, and out through the front door." "Wheelbarrow trails," repeated Mr. Brown. "But we've been in bed for 2 days." "That," said Mrs. Bird sternly, "is exactly what I mean." While the Browns were trying to solve the mystery of the wheelbarrow trails, Paddington was having an even more difficult time in the laundrette. "But I only opened the door to see where the washing had gone," he explained. He was sitting on the counter, wrapped in a blanket while the mess was being cleared up. "But it hadn't gone anywhere," said the stout lady. "The things only looked as if they had disappeared because they were going round so fast. They always do that." She sought for words to explain what she meant. It's a sort of phenomenon." "A phenomenon?" repeated Paddington. But he didn't say anything about a phenomenon. But it didn't say anything about a phenomenon in the instructions. The lady sighed. Washing machines were rather difficult to explain, and she'd not had many dealings with bears before. "Bubbles all over my machines," she exclaimed. "Water all over the floor. I've never seen such a mess." "Oh dear," said Paddington sadly. "I'm in trouble again." He looked at the pile of half-washed clothes next to him. He didn't know what Mrs. Bird would say when she heard all about it. And as for Mr. Curry... "I tell you what," said the stout lady as she caught sight of the expression on Paddington's face. "Seeing it's your very first time here, and we're not very busy, suppose we do it all again. It would never do to have a dissatisfied customer in a laundrette." She gave Paddington a wink. "Then we can put it all in the spin dryer, and if I've got time, I might even be able to iron it for you in the back room. After all, it's not every day we have a bear's washing to do." Mrs. Bird surveyed the neat pile of newly ironed laundry and then turned to Mr. and Mrs. Brown, who had just come downstairs for the first time. "Well," she said approvingly, "I never expected to see this. I couldn't have done it better myself." "I do hope it's all right, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington anxiously. "I had a bit of a phenomenon in the laundrette." "A phenomenon?" repeated Mrs. Brown. "But you can't have a phenomenon in the washing machine." "I did," said Paddington firmly, "and all the water came out." "I think you must be mistaken, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "A phenomenon means something strange." "And talking of strange things," said Mrs. Bird, looking hard at Paddington, "Mr. Curry knocked on the door a moment ago and left you a toffee. He says he's very pleased with his jerseys. He doesn't know what you've done to them, but they fit him for the first time in years. They've always been too large up until now." "Perhaps," said Mr. Brown, "there was a phenomenon in the washing machine after all." Paddington felt very pleased with himself as he made his way upstairs to his room. He was glad it had turned out all right in the end. As he closed the dining room door, he just caught a remark of Mrs. Bird's. "I think we're very lucky indeed," she said. "Looking after a big house like this for 2 days and doing all the washing into the bargain. That young bear's one of the old school." Paddington puzzled over the remark for some time, and in the end he went to consult his friend Mr. Gruber on the subject. When Mr. Gruber explained to him that it meant he was very reliable, Paddington felt even more pleased. Compliments from Mrs. Bird were very rare. "But all the better for having when they come, Mr. Brown," said Mr. Gruber. "All the better for having when they come."